All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. So I'd like to start by thanking everyone for joining us, and welcome to day 2 of our Banned Books Week live streams, which are sponsored by the American Library Association's Intellectual Freedom Roundtable, the Graphic Novels and Comics Roundtable, and Image Comics. Today, we're going to be discussing banned people and post-colonial narratives, and we are joined by 2 really fantastic guests. Our first is Sloane Leong, who is the author and artist of Prism Stalker, and you'll find her social media contact information there on the screen at Sloane. And we also have Henry Barajas, who is the author of VOZ DE M.A.Y.O, TATA RAMBO, and you'll also find his social media contact information at Henry Barajas. My name is Alea Perez. I am the president-elect of the Graphic Novels and Comics Roundtable, and I'm also the head of the Kids Library at the Elmhurst Public Library in the Chicago suburbs. Before we get started, I do want to share a quick history of Banned Books Week with you, and you'll find the information on the screen as well. Banned Books Week is a celebration of the freedom to read and express ideas, and it was first launched in 1982 by 3 organizations: the American Library Association, the American Booksellers Association, and the National Association of College Stores. Today, Banned Books Week is sponsored by or contributed to by ALA, as well as 13 other organizations, and reaches 2.8 billion people through mainstream media. This year's Banned Books Week theme is "Censorship Leaves Us in the Dark, Keep the Light On." And that includes initiatives such as the Dear Banned Author letter writing campaign, which encourages readers to reach out to banned or challenged creators via letters, emails, and tweets. The campaign also aims to raise awareness of books that have been threatened with censorship and inspire discussion about access to materials. Additionally, the Office for Intellectual Freedom is offering 2 remaining webinars, the first of which is called Ask Me Anything About Censorship, which will be later today at 6 p.m. Central Standard Time. And tomorrow they'll be doing Banned Books 101 at 1 o'clock p.m. Central Standard Time. You can also find promotional materials in the ALA store. You can access free downloads at the Banned Books Week website, and you can connect with others to discuss this topic on our Facebook group. Further resources can also be found at the URLs listed on the slide that you should see in front of you. So if you would like to report censorship, you can follow that first URL. You can also find additional information on Banned Book Weeks at the second, and you can learn more about the Intellectual Freedom and Graphic Novels and Comics Roundtable. Just a quick synopsis of who we are and what we do. The Graphic Novels and Comics Roundtable is a part of the American Library Association and is dedicated to supporting library staff in all aspects of engaging with graphic novels and comics. The ALA Intellectual Freedom Roundtable provides a forum, among other things, for the discussion of activities, programs, and problems in intellectual freedom of libraries and librarians. And Image Comics is a comic book and graphic novel publisher that was founded in 1992 by a collective of best-selling artists, and they have since gone on to become one of the largest comics publishers in the United States. So today, what we're going to be discussing includes the legacy of colonialism in literature and popular culture, the rise of post-colonial voices as a challenge to systems of underrepresentation, and banned people then and now, and the role of literature in that. So I want to welcome once again both Henry and Sloane. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thank you so much for allowing us to have this conversation today.
Yeah, I'm really excited to jump in with everyone. So we're going to go ahead and do just that and jump into the conversation. Sloane, your story, Prism Stalker, is set in a future society. And Henry, your story, VOZ DE M.A.Y.O, is set in the recent past. So starting with Sloane, can you both share a little bit more on what your stories are about and what motivated you to tell them?
Yeah, so Prism Stalker is a psychedelic far future science fiction adventure comic. It follows this young refugee girl who is enlisted by this academy to help colonize a sentient planet. So this book was inspired a lot by my Hawaiian heritage and Hawaiian history. It's a really interesting culture in Hawaii. There's an extreme blend of cultures and like a secondary like blending of cultures that they all had to like come together and form during colonization and when all the immigrants came. So yeah, I'm just really interested in exploring kind of like the blending of cultures, how people are forced to come together to create a community to survive, and also like the complicity of colonizing others when you yourself have been colonized.
Fantastic. And Henry.
Yeah, like you said, this is my story, La Voz de Mayo, TATA RAMBO, takes place in the early 1970s. It's just basically a post-World War II scenario where the city of Tucson was expanding so greatly thanks to the aerospace engineering and military ramping in the area. So a lot of people moved in and they needed places to go and they needed to get goods and services to and from Phoenix quicker. So they decided to expand the Interstate 10. And the perfect place they thought was to bulldoze right through a community that had been there for as long as anyone could remember. So thankfully, my great-grandfather, Ramon Jauregui, who was a Chicano activist, a World War II veteran, he co-founded the MAYO organization, the Mexican American Yaqui and others group to get sidewalks, plumbing, electricity, and just the types of services that everybody else was afforded in the city of Tucson to this very poor area of town that was specifically kept poor and in this specific area by only having one school there, having very few services there. So they already had started working with the community and ramping up their presence. And it wasn't until 1969 when the city of Tucson proposed to displace 12,000 people, eradicate 4,000 homes. So my great-grandfather, Ramon Jauregui, and the MAYO organization rallied the community. They did some peaceful protesting, and they worked with the city and the Arizona Department of Transportation to avoid that from happening. A lot of the credit was given to Morris K. Udall, who was a major voice for Native Americans in Southern Arizona. And for whatever reason, the tribe had didn't have the means or omitted the MAYO organization and the community at large, and giving a lot of the credit to Udall and some members of the tribe. So this was, thankfully, my great-grandfather handed me all this documentation that I was able to create a timeline and create an exciting story. Well, I like to think it's exciting story about these brown people that were whitewashed and that stood up and said no and protested and did the right thing.
Fantastic. So how is it that both stories, which are so disparate and as far as time and place, and one is fictional, one is nonfiction, how are they both able to address the topic of colonialism? So we'll start with you this time, Henry.
It's interesting to kind of see a lens through the voices of the people that were on the ground floor that were smart enough to publish these newsletters detailing the oppression that was coming and the steps they need to take to stop that from happening. This was as early as 1970. These were people that were in danger of losing their property that they had since the early 1800s, that they were, refugees of their own desert, the Sonoran Desert, having to flee from the Mexican government and to survive. And in order to preserve their very old Easter ritual, the community, my great-grandfather, Morris K. Udall, Senator DeConcini, they had to really make an argument to say that, you know, these people were here first and the line crossed them. And it's important that we preserve this type of identity to the Sonoran Desert. So I think it's interesting that now we live in a time now in 2019 where a lot of that possibility of the indigenous people working with government is so foreign. And I'm really grateful to be able to take those documents and those experiences and be able to bring them back into the light.
And Sloane, how do you see the fact that both of your stories are able to tell the same type of story about this issue, given their different times and places that the stories are occurring?
Yeah, I mean, it's very personal. We both have Chicano heritage. Like, this is just something that's embedded in our lives. So even though I'm looking at this topic through a genre and through like a far future lens, like, it's still based in my reality and my experience and my feelings and the experience of my family and stuff. So yeah.
And Sloane, as a follow-up to that, do you see any more safety or comfort in telling this type of story through a still very personal and connected way, but in a way that is not you specifically or not your family specifically?
Yeah, I mean, having that remove offers like a measure of safety. I feel like that's pretty common with any sort of like fiction writer, like that sort of buffer of fiction helps you explore things that you might be uncomfortable sharing or uncomfortable sharing about people you know. But yeah, it's just like, it's fun for me to explore this sort of like psychological impact that colonization has had on me and like my family in this way, because I can kind of blow it up in a way that's like on an epic galactic scale. And I feel like that lens is sort of like impact that just reading straight history might not, especially because like a lot of Hawaiian history has been like lost or erased. So being able to kind of like explode it into this like kaleidoscopic drama is fun for me, but it's also lets me have like a lot of control in how I explore these topics.
So for those in our audience who have heard us throw a few words around now that they may not be familiar with all of that much, would either of you be willing to share with them what it is or how it is you define colonialism and what you see as some characteristics of it?
For me, I think I explore specifically like settler colonialism, which has to do with like people taking over territory and making an attempt to replace the indigenous population. And there's also a process of like assimilation and integration. And a lot of that has to do, again, with like erasing the native culture. So that's one form of colonialism.
Yeah, I mean, it's as basic as the entertainment that you consume. You know, a lot of musicians that people might recognize, like Link Wray and Jimi Hendrix, were Native Americans, you know, at least partially, and had to hide that and be able to take that part of themselves and bring it into their art. But if the masses knew that, it would, you know, it probably wouldn't have catched on as quickly as it did. Also, gentrification. I'm from Tucson, Arizona, so I've moved to Los Angeles. A lot of, you know, the indigenous areas have been completely stamped out, and the areas that we inhabit, like Los Feliz, and a lot of the cities that are named after people that lived here are basically assimilated. And a lot of places in like San Francisco where there are parking lots used to live where Native American burial grounds were. So it's wherever you stand and wherever you go, there is going to be and whatever you listen to and like, it is derived from indigenous cultures and peoples and places that have been masked.
So the groups who have been historically subjugated, that's one way of defining colonialism, is kind of conquering and erasing groups. People who belong to those marginalized groups that have this history often wrestle with ideas surrounding identity. And that was really big, definitely in Prism Stalker. And from what I've read of VOZ DE M.A.Y.O, there was some of that too, regarding who got credit for, as you had mentioned, for being part of this resistance. So you see topics of assimilation versus resistance, of language, religion, and other customs either being adopted or rejected. So how do these stories, or these themes rather, play out in your stories without giving too much away?
Let's see. Identity. That's like that's a really big topic for me in my book. How do I wrestle with it? I'm like, that's the whole book. I'm like trying to like summarize. Basically, I don't know. I have a lot of complicated feelings with identity, especially being mixed. I'm like Native Hawaiian on one side. I'm Chinese. I'm Native American and Mexican on my mother's side. So being mixed, I have a lot of not issues, but thoughts on like authenticity, who is allowed to do what with what cultural aspects. It's very messy, and there's a lot of like very polarized opinions about that. But I don't know. I just try and embrace as much of my culture as I can and I want. I'm really not into drawing lines between cultures, and I think that comes a lot from living in Hawaii and just being surrounded by, we have like Chinese, Filipino, Marshallese, Portuguese people. And all our like slang embodies all of that language as well. So to me, that was always like extremely utopic, even though it obviously had roots in very like violent colonization and imperialism. But that's always been my just like my ideal community, is just having so many different people from different walks of life, different cultures who see things differently than me. So that really influences my work a lot.
Yeah, I mean, I'm in the same boat where you're not brown enough because you don't speak Spanish, or you're not a card-carrying Yaqui, and you're not white enough because, of the way you speak and your pedigree. And in my book, and I don't mind giving every detail away because it's a story that's been suppressed for 50 years. So in my book, it starts off with me trying to just work against the time and get my great grandfather's story on paper before he passes away, because he was in his 80s. He was battling emphysema. He was in and out of the VA. And it bothered me and my family that his accomplishments were completely forgotten and not in any, text that could be available. So identity was a big thing, because I had no idea how much of my how much privilege I had of living in Old Pascua in a very, compared to the way it used to be, in a place that had, light and had patrol, and it had, just the community center and multiple churches, and this school that's been closed down since 2009. There's a school in the area. However, the tribe has decided to install a new casino. I lived in a time where I could walk around freely without having to worry about, just blatant crime. That was a problem as well. So just living in that privilege and learning to acknowledge that and be able to kind of push forward. These brown people deserve credit for what they did.
So this topic of colonialism, and post-colonialism, it's obviously much bigger than your two stories. Your stories exist in this larger context. So in what ways have you seen the legacy of colonialism pervade other stories that you have either made, that you've seen created, or have actually consumed? And you did mention, excuse me, earlier, Henry, a little bit about, you know, Jimi Hendrix having to hide his identity. So what are some other effects that colonialism has had on the production of pop culture and different literatures?
I mean, if you go back to, I mean, it just, the effect has been mostly negative. You'll be very hard pressed to find any positive Native American, or right now, I think we're very fortunate in the sense that Latinx and Afro Latinx voices are being raised to platforms and be able to express positive imagery and tell more compelling stories. But I mean, if you were to go to the Emmys now and see any Native American actors, you wouldn't see any. I mean, there was a Native American activist that spoke at the summit yesterday, and she talked about clean water, and I can't even draw her name, you know, and that's a problem. That was one of the biggest intents that I had with telling this story. There's no one named Tonto. You know, Tonto is derived from tonto, which means stupid in Spanish, and that was the Lone Ranger, the White Hope. That was his sidekick, and it was important for me in this story to reverse engineer the Native American character and allow them to speak like regular people, because they do. If you were to go to a reservation now, they wouldn't, you know, puff on like a peace pipe and listen to the ground. They'd be just like you and me, and it's important for me to be able to shine that type of light on just normal everyday people that just so happen to be indigenous to their land.
Yeah, I guess I'll just like name some of my favorite like books that are inspiration for me, specifically like all of Octavia Butler's like bibliography is a huge inspiration and like influence on me. I feel like she explores colonization and assimilation and integration in such complexity and on like such a massive scale, specifically in like the Xenogenesis saga, which has these like benevolent aliens. Well, they consider themselves benevolent, you know, kind of like repopulating Earth, but as alien hybrids. And it goes through like 3 generations of these like human alien hybrids learning to like reculture Earth in this new way that they engage with it. And this, I guess like a anatomical and like biological colonization is also another big thing, like the borders of our body, how we transgress the borders of our thoughts and our language. So she's like a huge influence on me.
Yeah, so Henry, are there any graphic novels, books, or other media that have really resonated with you in a positive or inspirational way?
I like depressing stuff. I don't really like no, but I mean, if you were to, I guess in Post-Colonial, I guess within the topic, I think March, John Lewis's March, is what really inspired me to go from, I started off making comics, but I went into journalism, and then I was writing biography, and then to see John Lewis's life down in a graphic novel format really just changed my life, and was able to realize, oh, there's for voices and people that need to tell their stories and don't have the budgets of film and could be able to do something very dynamic. You know, when I was growing up, there was 2 guys, John Prounstart and Ryan Huna Smith, who they claim to have created the first American superhero comic book called Tribal Force, and that was you know, they were always an inspiration to me in the fact that they had gotten so high there, get so far up to get to this point, but because of the publishing company shuttering, their voices and their story was never to be finished. So that was a positive impact on me. The Hernandez brothers, Love and Rockets, you know, just quintessential cartooning comics, and those were some of the most, I guess, influential stuff.
So my next question to both of you is, how do we center the voices and culture of marginalized people and groups in a way that acknowledges that there is a future and there is opportunity for growth, and that the stories aren't or shouldn't all be on past and losses? So how do you, as creators or as consumers, how do you help to push things in that direction?
I mean, just direct support if possible. I feel like in comics, especially, a lot of marginalized creators, indigenous creators can access the materials to make their own comics and also publish them, like through Kickstarter or through Patreon. That direct support is really important. I know it's been important for me. Yeah, I don't know if I care so much about like focusing only on the future, because I feel like we still have a lot to excavate from our past. I know some people are like, oh, it's like, so like you're like with indigenous people or Native Americans, they talk about like their past. It's always like so sad. I'm like, yeah, it's like a lot to unpack. There's a lot there that we're still grappling with that still has like, you know, really far-reaching consequences that all these generations later we're still feeling. So yeah, just direct support basically.
Yeah, I mean, if it weren't for Kickstarter and my community and network of friends and family and a lot of complete strangers helping me publish the first 2 chapters through Kickstarter, I wouldn't have been able to have a fully realized idea to go to Image Comics and Top Cow Productions. Right now, Kickstarter, Patreon, Indiegogo, even as simple as going to a Native American recreational center. There's a lot of ways to volunteer, to go into classes and help kids and just be that positive voice for them, to let them know that, you know, that whatever they have to say is just as good as anybody else's, and going to festivals that benefit the local communities, especially the indigenous communities. I was just at the Selmar Taco Festival, and that was just a whole petri dish of that community, just, you know, trying to do better for themselves and get the word out about the types of things they were doing about improving roads and work. And there was actual politicians there that lived and serviced that community. So going to comic book conventions and perusing Artist Alley and actually talking to cartoonists there and going to small press expos, and there's a resurgence in library cons that are happening now. I was just at Bakersfield Comics, their library convention that was free to the public. Anyone can go. And we donated, Top Cow and I had donated about 300 graphic novels to the community, because from what the librarians have told us, the Bakersfield area is one of the most illiterate parts of the United States. So just starting off in your own backyard really helps. And then going and beyond yourself is on the internet. It's also a big way as well.
I would also say, just to follow up really quick, one thing that's really prevalent in comics is like having, especially in like Cape comics, like, oh, there's like a new Black superhero, there's a new Indigenous superhero. But it's really important for readers, and I mean, even more so publishers, to like look at who's actually writing those characters, which a lot of the time is usually just like a white guy. And it's like, I know it's nice to see that representation, but that's not always has like an impact on real life people and real life creators. So if you can like make an effort to support like real Indigenous authors, like make an effort to do that, because just enjoying a character who's, you know, of similar representation of like identity to you, which is great and all, there's nothing wrong with that, but it's just something to think about.
I agree. I mean, I think what comics, one of the uphill battles that Sloane and I have is we're up against Miles Morales Spider-Man, who is a Afro Latinx character that was created by Brian Michael Bendis and Sarah Pacelli. Brian Michael Bendis himself has adopted Black children, and he could be able to draw those experiences and make those characters. But, it's really easy for folks to make that A to B line and say, oh, well, I'm supporting this character, and this is who I can see myself in. And it's only benefiting Disney, and it's only benefiting, it doesn't benefit the people that could use it. But there is no shame in having that, but also acknowledging that there is a way to have that representation and see yourself in a more grassroots effort.
So kind of touching on what you both just mentioned, do you think there should be a line drawn on who is maybe not able, but supposed to be creating certain stories? Because that is something that does still happen. And you can also touch on whether or not you think that that's a remnant possibly of colonialism, is who is allowed to, who is able to, who's being given a platform to speak. So if either of you want to kind of touch on that idea.
Yeah, I mean, I don't believe in drawing hard lines about who should be able to explore what character, what world. I mean, I think that's the beauty of fiction, of being able to immerse yourself both as a reader and as an author in another world and another perspective. But at the same time, there's I think the remnants of colonization, like you brought out, is a violence of thinking that your perspective is universal, and how that will kind of backfire on you in your story or your comic or whatever. Maybe not having enough empathy for characters that are not of similar identity can be a problem. And also I guess not being open to criticism is an issue. But I as a mixed person, I'm not emblematic of a standard Hawaiian person, a standard Mexican person. So I can't write. I'm just writing from my own singular perspective, and I'm not trying to write from anything else, from anyone else's broader. I am speaking for all Hawaiian people and all mixed people. It's impossible. I can't do that. So yeah, what do you think, Henry?
Yeah, I mean, I think, as a creator or as an artistic person, you can tell whatever you want, but you have to recognize that when you put it out there, there might be a response. Maybe people care or even buy it or subscribe to it, but you have to be ready to answer some questions that your reader is going to have. But it's always important to operate under the assumption that your reader is smarter than you, and they're going to ask complicated questions about the types of fiction that you're putting out there. If you are like myself, I recently wrote a story for Bun and Tea, and I wanted to explore what would it be like to be a Russian refugee fleeing Russia, going to New York because they're afraid that they're going to be beaten to death on the street for being gay. That's a story that I wanted to put myself in and see what it was like. Am I the person to tell that story? Probably not, but I want to tell that story, and I'm ready to back what I'm doing with information and with empathy and with the understanding that this is what's happening out there, and that's not the story that I can find. So if I can't find it, I'm going to try to tell it.
So to that end, why is it, do you think, we can't find certain stories? Why are these folks who are living these very real, very current experiences, why do you two feel that that's still something that we're running into, that we're not seeing that opportunity possibly? What do you see as a potential cause?
The lack of diversity, kind of.
Yeah.
I think it's twofold. For me, and I mean, I think for most Indigenous people, we're coming up against systematic educational problems. I got my GED when I was 16 because the schools in Hawaii that I went to were terrible. They didn't care about the students. There was police at the school every day, walking around doing security, just being poor in general and not having as many opportunities. I mean, when you're just struggling to survive, it's hard to engage creatively. There's from colonization and systemic like violence. There's a lot of like mental illness that's prevalent and like sometimes overly prevalent in Indigenous and other marginalized communities. And then also again, just like if you can have like and like I don't know, it's kind of hard. It's not hard to explain, but it's like there's lots of white writers and like, oh, we need diversity in this franchise, so just make like a brown character that works. And you're a good writer, you have the education, so you just do it, you know. And it's like that may not be like done with malice, but it's definitely an extreme setback for creators that like marginalized creators that do have the opportunity to be able to pursue a creative career.
Yeah, you had mentioned this in your document, Alea, but in Tucson, where I'm from, in Tucson, Arizona, the Tucson Unified School District had eliminated Mexican American studies, and it was just a way to suppress a predominantly Latinx community from learning about themselves and learning about the colonialism, learning about the invasion and racism and death that is only empowers and only to inform a community that should know a lot about that. So the media that we're going to consume is not going to address the types of things that we will recognize and within ourselves and our community, because that's not profitable for anybody to enrage everyone. So I had to do my own research on my own background and really dig within the library in Tucson, which, I mean, I'm very grateful for the cataloging they have done and the historical books that they have available, also at the University of Arizona, and people willing to talk to me. But it's not to our benefit to know about the things that this country has done to Indigenous and people of the southern border. So you're not going to get those stories because a lot of the times people don't really know those stories at all.
Mm-hmm. There's also a lot of like cultural trauma. I believe like in Hawaii for a long time, the Hawaiian language was banned. And that's the same for a lot of Native American cultures in school. The language was banned, you know, and growing up, not knowing your mother tongue and having to assimilate into your colonizer's tongue. And then later, you know, taking in stories that feature, you know, the colonizing culture as heroes and the enemies or like the like lackeys as like native coded or dark skinned. It's like there's so much like cultural self-esteem that gets lost because of that, just because it's completely obliterated your sense of self and culture and identity. And so that takes a long time to like untangle, to be able to be like, oh, actually our stories are worth telling and sharing and pursuing.
Yeah, I mean, my parents, or my great-grandfather and my great-grandparents, they were not allowed to speak Spanish and not allowed to state their ceremonies in school or even have a woof of that. And even that carried into my generation. We never really talked about the Yaqui Easter celebrations, and we weren't taught Spanish growing up because my parents feared that we would speak choppy English and that would prevent us from getting good jobs. So there is a lot of negative connotations to embracing your heritage and your family's bloodline. So that's I think a large reason of why we don't get to see a lot of these diverse stories, because we're not allowed to talk about them.
So for librarians, in terms of materials, and because this is Banned Books Week, these two terms kind of get used interchangeably, but there is a difference. Materials that are challenged in libraries are those that are still being attempted to be removed or restricted for access for folks. And that could be by an individual person, it could be by a group, and it can be for a variety of reasons. The banning is the actual removal of access of said materials. Do you think the concept of challenging in banning is something that doesn't just apply to materials, but to people as well, based off of some of the stuff that you just said.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely, I don't think anyone does like any direct challenging of like authors per se. Well, maybe not direct banning, but there's definitely a challenges being made. Like, is your book going to like, you know, make money? Does it look profitable? Usually if it's specifically Indigenous, like that's pretty hard sell for people. As a woman author, I guess banning can also come up because like if you've had an issue with, say, a contemporary author that you're working with, a colleague, I should say, that can be a problem for publishers, because they're like, oh, what if something else happens and then this is like bad PR? You know, that's actually like a stipulation in a lot of contracts now, that if you're involved with something that is like going to give them bad PR or is like going to cause like a hassle on Twitter, then they'll just like be able to like end your contract. So yeah, there's a lot of like bureaucratic challenging going on.
I mean, we're seeing, and specifically with comics, a lot of banning and censorship, because it's easier for, in their opinions, children to obtain and be able to read. It's a lot of the times, like you said, a group will want to ban Native American studies or Mexican American studies, which will in turn ban any writer talking about that. So that, those people are effectively banned from schools and possibly libraries. So thankfully, you know, there are a lot of groups out there looking out for these sort of things, but the religious integrity of some groups and just blatant racism will always challenge people of color to just have to fight that much harder to tell their stories, and to find publishers like Sloane said, willing to take that chance on those diverse voices.
So you might argue that the creation of these stories is an act of resistance. It is people very intentionally trying to share the stories of either their ancestors or hopefully their descendants, depending on which direction the story's going, so that people are more educated on the culture and some of the issues that they've faced as being part of it, but also some of the celebrations that they've been able to experience. So kind of tying this back to a larger view, taking it out a little bit of comics specifically, we do see a lot of the focus still on white voices. So just one example, if we're looking at the recent talks about the environment, the teen Greta Thunberg has been getting a lot of attention lately for her activism. But what this seems to be doing is completely erasing the work that was done by a lot of the Indigenous for the No DPAL movement a few years ago. So with regards to that, do you see that as a bigger part of colonialism? Do you see that as part of the system that's in place? Do you think there's any relationship there? And again, how does this kind of speak to the ability of people in certain cultures to actually share their stories?
I mean, we live in an age where social media and being able to and get that and find journalists that are willing to tell certain stories. I mean, as long as there has been general assemblies, there's always been children begging and pleading for their adult counterparts to do something about the crisis that we had faced then, and we are now, you know, face to face at the present moment. I fear that we're going to keep having the same conversations and saying, well, you know, in 2019 there was a child that sailed, you know, and now it's we're just going to keep having the same conversations. So it was important for me when I made VOZ DE M.A.Y.O. and started in 2015, when the idea of Trump becoming president was a joke. Everyone dismissed it. Everyone was just, it couldn't possibly happen. And here we are. You know, it's important to tell these stories now. It's important to just, and while in the 4 years that I had wrote and self-published and worked with Jay Gonzo, Clay Napier, and Bernardo Brice to tell my story, that was the beacon of hope for me. That was the light at the end of the tunnel, that these people 50 years ago stood up to their local government and said, no, this isn't happening anymore, and be able to craft that narrative and create the timeline and show and prove that this actually happened, that it can happen again.
Yeah, this is like, I don't know, it's hard to, I mean, the whole Greta thing and how her voice is being like amplified over others. I mean, that's like, I don't know, I feel like that's pretty expected. But it's hard for me to engage with that stuff, just because I'm like, I don't believe that power will ever be uncorrupted. And I feel like right now, a lot of people are like, you know, you're like protesting, they're trying to like, you know, make a movement towards uncorrupting power, and I just don't think that's possible. So I don't have high hopes there. To me, it has to start from like a personal basis, and I don't know. I have a lot of messy thoughts about that.
I think that's a very nice way of summarizing this whole topic, really, though, it is very messy, it's very complicated, and there is so much history involved in this that, yeah, I think that's a fair take on that. So I do want to leave some time for questions if anyone in the audience does have any. So I'm going to ask you guys one more question. If we don't have questions from the audience after this, then I'll keep asking you. There's so much that I'm loving that you guys are saying that I'd love to hear more about. But to kind of touch back on, so Henry had mentioned the Tucson Unified School District, ban on Mexican American studies. We recently had the protests in Hawaii around the planned installation of a telescope on sacred land. Do these situations, do these behaviors from society at large, do these allow us to say that we are now living in a post-colonial society?
I don't think so. I don't think it's a thing that will end. I think this is happening. Like a lot of people, I mean, generally when people think of colonialism, they're thinking of like large scale violence, conquering, taking over. But to me, like growing up in Hawaii, this sort of stuff happens also on a really insidious, like small scale, like commodifying language, commodifying, you know, pieces of clothing. You know, we're like a militarized tourist state. And that's affected a lot about how we're seen, how we see ourselves, how we interact with other people. So yeah, I think this is a perpetual thing that will be going on.
Yeah, I was listening to NPR yesterday, and there was a discussion, or there was a podcast that was highlighting a doctor in Puerto Rico that was intentionally inserting viruses into his patients and actually ignoring patients and not treating them and calling them experimental animals. And this was like, I don't know, maybe 70s, 60s. And he was able to flee Puerto Rico after he had wrote a letter to a colleague in the States that he was going to send, left it on his desk. The Puerto Rican staff found this letter and was able to, you know, to get rid of him, but they weren't able to charge him. And he had came back to the United States and accidentally created chemotherapy and was able to get away with the horrible things that he had done. And if you look up his name, I forget his name. I'm going to try to look it up on my phone when the questions start rolling in, but he was able to get away with that. And like you said, it doesn't have to be a mass scale of violence. It could be as small as just, a medical procedure. It could be as small as just signing on Richie Valens and saying, you can't use Valentin you have to be Italian. You know, it's as small as just moving into Los Feliz, and it's always going to be prevalent and among us. And we're going to have to at one point say, no, we can't just keep living like this and just pretending these things didn't happen and just assimilating just because it makes everybody else feel comfortable. We have to start we have to get angry. We have to make more art that gets in people's faces, and we have to just do any small step that we can to challenge and say, this isn't right. We can't keep living like this, and we can't keep pushing voices of color down, and we can't keep ignoring these tragic history because it makes everyone feel bad.
And it's like, as long as there's people who want power, which is anyone who has greed, which is everyone, there's always going to be some sort of colonialism of wanting to take from other people. I mean, even if the US, you know, ceded from Hawaii, there's Hawaiians that claim to want to be, that are trying to claim like the Hawaiian monarchy, which is something I don't agree with. I don't believe in kings or human monarchies or human rulership generally, but you know, this isn't just something that's, you know, isolated to like Western cultures or something. This is even on, you know, indigenous cultures too. We have issues with, you know, patriarchy, with power, with machismo, like, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, no, definitely. And that's and I think just with I mean, it as problematic as it is, the women's march and a lot of the Me Too movement has helped push the patriarchy to recognize what's happening and hopefully changing. It's not as fast as we like it to, but we just have to keep finding ways to make it more social media palatable for people and make it in such a rhymey way that people can get behind the actually addressing these problems. And I found it on my phone. His name is Cornelius P. Rhodes. If you want to Google his name and see the horrible things that he's done and got away with.
Yeah, and Tina from ALA did drop in the chat for those of you who can see that, that the podcast that Henry was mentioning is Throughline from NPR. So if there are any questions from the audience, now would be a great time to get them in. You can go ahead and enter them into the chat if you would like. And while we wait a moment to see if those start coming in, I did want to ask, have either of you read the graphic novel, This Place 150 Years Retold?
I have not.
I don't know. I don't think so. Who's it by?
It's a compilation, so it's an anthology. So for those in the audience who are interested in checking that item out, which I highly recommend, it is actually a compilation of, I believe, 10 stories told by Indigenous creators. It's actually Canadian-based, but you see a lot of the same history in Canada as you see in the US, so it's very similar in that regard.
What was it called?
It's This Place 150 Years Retold. And what's really great about that story that I really enjoyed about what both of you said was that it does allow for the storytellers to share their history, but in a way that recenters them. So it's giving those voices an opportunity to really talk about the lives that their different tribes have had and their different nations have had over the past 150 years. And the last one, very much like Sloane's story, actually throws the whole thing into the future. So it's looking at things from a future standpoint, and we're still here and we're still around to make good trouble. But we do have a question from the audience, and that is, how do you feel about not having been taught Spanish while growing up? Do you feel that something is missing?
Yes, I have missed a lot of conversations with my Tia Yolanda, who is someone that was so beautiful and special to me in my life. And, you know, we had to pretty much pantomime and just hug and embrace whether, you know, and try to speak. She had learned a lot of English. I learned some Spanish, and we were able to have simple conversations. But yeah, I mean, just a lot, like financially and my career wise, being the coconut or the kid that just like looks like he should be able to speak fluent Spanish, but can't. It was embarrassing growing up, and I'm in time, listening to a lot of Spanish music and trying to read in Spanish and practicing. When I used to run a donut shop, and everyone was Salvadorian and spoke fluent Spanish, so they were helping me and coaching me through that as well. But yeah, I missed a lot on a lot of different levels.
Okay, so here's another. So this is from someone who says, as a white person, they're looking for ways to take on the emotional burden of having conversations about this with other white people, and was wondering if either of you had advice on how to structure that kind of programming in libraries. And this person is a children's librarian. Is a panel typically more effective than a lecture? Any and all advice, with many thanks.
I feel like a panel seems like it'd be more effective. Well, I get tired with lectures. My mind drifts, but if there's like a group of people having a conversation, especially if your topic is about engaging with like a specific identity or ethnicity, and having actually like those people come and talk would be nice. Also, like paying speakers to come, giving them like a little honorarium for their work, because I do believe that it's good to take on that burden, but at the same time, it's like you won't always have all the insight that you might need to explain certain things. So supporting people who can do that is also really helpful.
I was lucky growing up in high school. His name was Mr. Johnson. He used the mouse to articulate and educate my class on the Holocaust. And it was at no point, I remember thinking this, at no point was I ever so invested in learning, because it was in a comic book format. And I think comic books inherently are one of the most, if not the most primitive way to communicate. As the champion and creator of the graphic novel, Will Eisner, had said, the comics and sequential art is how we first learned to communicate with each other, with cave drawings and using pictures and to be able to tell a story. So I think you having to and wanting to have this conversation is very special, and I appreciate you trying to do this. But using comics like that, to point back again, Miles Morales, the Afro-Latinx Spider-Man, and using these palatable forms of media to be like, oh, I can see that connection, whether it be through the film, comics. And I think comic books is the best way to have it, by looking at March and looking at I hate to plug my own book, but VOZ DE M.A.Y.O, TATA RAMBO. And if you would like a digital copy, feel free to reach out to me and I will send you the advanced reader's copy. But looking for actually Bedside Press, Hope Nicholson, who's a publisher in Canada, she's been going out of her way to uplift Canadian Indigenous people and looking to publish those people. And just looking for those avenues and trying to have these conversations with comics is probably the best way to do it.
Yeah, and I'll just throw in a quick resource. If you're unaware, you can follow on either Twitter or there's a blog for Dr. Deb Reese, DEBREESE. She does a lot of work with diversity Jedis, is what they call themselves. And they specifically look at children's literature. And I do believe when graphic novels come into the mix, they'll also address those. But they do a great job of trying to point out books or other materials that have problematic information in them. And so if you still want to use those things, you should just do so with that knowledge that there are issues. And just a quick example of that, Raina Telgemeyer's Ghosts has been targeted. Yep, you got that right, Tina. Raina Telgemeyer's Ghosts is one that has been targeted as having problematic components to it. It tells the story of a young Latino family living in California near a mission, but sells it in a completely inappropriate way. So you can go read her articles or a lot of others. So just doing research, I think, is the big key. All right. Henry and Sloane, did you have any other things that you wanted to leave us with today before we wrap up?
No, I'm really appreciative of you inviting me. It was really cool. It was nice talking to both of you.
Yeah, I just wanted to say thank you again, and thanks to ALA, the Graphic Novel Roundtable Facebook group. Also, if you are going to New York Comic Con, I will be there at the library day at the Image booth. Like I said, if you reach out to me directly through Facebook, social media, you can email me, henry@topcow.com. I can send you the advanced reader's copy. I can also send you all the books that we do at Top Cow that promote STEM and sex positivity. And thank you so much for joining in our conversation and recognizing the importance of the topic that we're discussing.
And thank you both, Henry and Sloane. You had great insights to share. I hope everyone walked away with some really great information. The live streams will be continuing this week. So tomorrow there will be a discussion on banned books and civil rights. On Thursday, LGBTQ challenges. And on Friday, it'll be wrapping up with access issues, privatization, and gatekeeping. So once again, thank you both to Henry and Sloane. Thank you so much to the different ALA roundtables, Intellectual Freedom, and our own Graphic Novels and Comics roundtable. We hope to see everyone the rest of the week. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.